The deep, red liquid splashed onto the tip of my scuffed leather shoe, soaking through the fabric and chilling my skin. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Above me, Julian Vane tilted his crystal glass further, a cruel smirk dancing on his lips as the last drops of a $500 Cabernet ruined my only suit. You see this glass? Julian's voice boomed, cutting through the jazz music of the penthouse. This single pour is worth more than you spent on your entire wardrobe. But don't just stand there like a statue. You're getting the marble dirty. Clean it up. Use your tie if you have to, it looks like a rag anyway. I looked at my wife. Her face was a mask of pure terror. She was clutching her bag so hard her knuckles were white, her eyes pleading with me to stay silent. This was her night, her big promotion. And in 10 seconds, her boss hadn't just humiliated me, he had turned her dream into a public execution. What Julian didn't know was that 3 hours ago, I had signed the final documents to acquire his entire legacy. He thought he was looking at a nobody. He thought he was looking at a +1 who didn't belong in his elite world. He had no idea that tomorrow morning I wouldn't just be his guest. I would be his executioner. When we had stepped out of the elevator earlier that night, the air in the penthouse smelled of expensive cigars and quiet desperation. Sarah had smoothed her dress for the 10th time, her hand trembling as she tucked it under my arm. She whispered for me to be patient, to ignore whatever Julian might say, because a senior VP position would change our lives forever. She thought we were struggling. She didn't know I had spent the last 3 years building a shadow empire, waiting for the exact moment Julian Vane's greed would make him vulnerable. As we moved through the crowd of men in $6,000 suits and women, dripping in diamonds, we were invisible. To them, we were background noise. Then, the king of the vultures spotted us. "Ah, Sarah. Our little rising star," Julian shouted, holding court in the center of the room. He didn't look Sarah in the eye. He scanned my off-the-rack charcoal suit with a look of pure disgust. "I see you brought the baggage. I thought I told you this was a high-level networking event, not bring your disappointing husband to work day. Tell me, friend, what exactly do you do? I've heard you're between ventures. Is that the new word for being a parasite?" The circle of executives chuckled. Sarah flinched, trying to defend me, calling me a brilliant consultant, but Julian just barked a laugh. He leaned in close, the scent of expensive scotch hitting my face. He told me he didn't. Like people like me, parasites, living off the success of women like Sarah. He called me a stain on his company's image. Julian signaled a waiter and took a fresh glass. He looked down at my shoes, which were polished but clearly not Italian leather. With a slow, deliberate flick of his wrist, he tilted the glass. The wine poured out in a steady stream, soaking my trousers and leaving a jagged red mark across the white marble floor. The room went silent. The only sound was the drip of the wine hitting the floor. "Oops," Julian said, his eyes dancing with delight. My hand slipped. But a man who wears shoes that cheap probably doesn't mind a little extra color. When Sarah tried to protest, Julian's face snapped from playful to demonic. He pointed a finger inches from her nose, telling her that if she wanted the VP title, she better tell her dog to heel. He demanded I apologize to him for getting in the way of his wine. I looked at Sarah. I saw the heartbreak in her eyes as she whispered for me to just do it. But I didn't apologize. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and wiped a single drop of wine from my hand. I told him he should be very careful with what he spills, because some stains never come out. Julian's laughter was harsh. He called for security to get the trash out of his penthouse. He told Sarah she could stay to discuss paperwork, but I was to wait on the curb where I belonged. As the guards grabbed my arms, I looked at him one last time and told him to check his email at midnight. The cool night air hit my face as I walked out, but I wasn't cold. I was on fire. I walked 2 blocks to a parked black SUV where my head of legal, Marcus, was waiting with 3 laptops glowing in the dark. He asked if it had happened. I told him. Julian had poured wine on my shoes and insulted my wife in front of 100 people. Marcus sighed and hit a key on his keyboard. He confirmed that the board of Omni Global had given the green light. We held 51% of the debt. The moment the clock struck 12, the swap would trigger. I wouldn't just own the company. I would own Julian's house, his cars, and the very penthouse he had just thrown me out of. I asked about the embezzlement files, the evidence that Julian had been skimming from the employee pension fund to cover his gambling debts. Marcus had it all. He asked if we should call the police, but I told him no. I didn't want him in jail yet. I wanted him to feel the moment the floor disappeared. At 11:58 p.m., I sat in the back of the SUV, watching the digital clock. Sarah sent me a text crying, saying Julian was forcing her to sign a non-compete, or he would blackball her from the industry. I gritted my teeth and told Marcus to send the introduction email to all 5,000 employees. The clock hit midnight. Merger complete. I was now the chairman. I walked back into the penthouse just as the party was winding down. Julian was holding a pen out to Sarah, a predatory grin on his face. When he saw me, he started screaming for security to throw me over the balcony, but the guards didn't move. I told him to check his pocket. Julian sneered, but his phone started buzzing. Then Arthur, the CFO, had his phone buzz. Then every executive in the room. Julian pulled his device out, and his face went from red to a sickly pale grey. He gasped, asking what this was. I walked right into the center of the light and told him to read the signature. At the bottom. He looked at me, his hands shaking so hard he dropped his glass. It shattered at his own feet. He whispered the name Omega Group. He asked if that was me. I told him I was the consultant he wanted to fix the plumbing, and I was there to tell him that the trash was finally being taken out. But as Julian's knees buckled, the elevator doors opened one more time. A woman in a blood-red suit stepped out, clutching a folder that made even my lead counsel look nervous. She walked straight to me and said that while the win was impressive, the board wasn't happy about the circus I'd created. She turned to Sarah and handed her a black envelope, saying it was time she saw the contract I had signed 10 years ago to get the money to save her. She told my wife that I didn't own the company, that I was just the most expensive slave they had ever bought. Sarah opened the envelope, her eyes widening in horror as she looked at a photo inside. She looked at me like I was a stranger and ran for the elevator. I tried to follow, but a heavy shadow fell over the doorway. A man I thought was dead stepped into the light. The black envelope slipped from Sarah's fingers, fluttering to the marble floor like a dying bird. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The look of pure, unadulterated horror in her eyes was a sharper blade than anything Julian Vane had ever wielded. She turned and bolted toward the elevator, her heels clicking a frantic, rhythmic beat that echoed the shattering of our marriage. I moved to follow her, my heart hammering against my ribs, but a massive suit-clad arm barred my path. The lady needs space. Leo, a voice rasped, a voice I hadn't heard in a decade. I looked up. Standing in the doorway was a ghost. A man with skin like weathered parchment and eyes that held the cold vacuum of deep space. It was Silas Van Julian's father, the man the world believed had died in a private jet crash off the coast of Amalfi. He wasn't dead. He was the shadow behind the Omega Group. He was the one who had funded my rise. And now he had come to collect. Julian was still on his knees, staring at his father as if he were seeing a demon. Dad, you're alive? Silas didn't even look at his son. He looked at me. You did well. Leo, you dismantled my son's arrogance with the precision of a surgeon. You proved that he was never fit to lead this empire. But you forgot the most important rule of the game. Never use someone else's money to settle a personal debt. Julian scrambled to his feet, his face a pathetic mask of desperation. Dad, he took everything. He ruined the company. Silas silenced him with a single sharp raise of his hand. You ruined the company the moment you forgot that power is a burden, not a toy. Now be silent. He turned back to me. The red-suited woman, Elena, stepped into his side like a loyal hound. The Omega Group didn't give you billions because we liked your story. Leo, we gave it to you because we needed a clean, untraceable front to consolidate the Vane assets. Now that you've done the heavy lifting, your services are no longer required. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had spent years thinking I was the predator, the mastermind behind the curtain. In reality, I was just a highly paid janitor sent to clean up a family mess. You think I'm just going to walk away? I stepped closer, my voice a low, dangerous growl. I own the debt. I signed the swap. And the swap contains a key man clause, Elena interjected, her smile as sharp as a razor. If the chairman is found to be in breach of the moral turpitude agreement, say, by hiding his criminal past or his true financial backing from the board, the shares revert to the primary creditor. That's us, Leo. I looked around the room. The executives who had just been nodding to me in fear were now looking at the floor. They knew who the real power was. Julian, seeing the shift, regained a spark of his old malice. He walked over to the desk, grabbed a bottle of water, and poured it slowly over the documents I had just signed. Looks like the trash is being taken out after all, Julian sneered, his voice regaining its oily confidence. Did you really think a nobody like you could outsmart a Vane? You were just a tool. And like any tool that gets too dull, you're being replaced. I ignored him, my eyes locked on Silas. Sarah has nothing to do with this. Leave her out of it. Sarah is the only reason you're still breathing, Silas said, stepping into the center of the penthouse. But she's seen the truth now. She knows that every dollar you spent on her, every debt you cleared was blood money. She doesn't see a hero, Leo. She sees a liar. The weight of it hit me then. The 3 years of silence, the secret bank accounts, the lies I told her at the kitchen table about saving for the future. I thought I was protecting her. I thought I was being her knight, but I had built our life on a foundation of sand, and the tide had finally come in. Silas signaled to the security guards, my guards who now moved toward me with cold, professional efficiency. You have 5 minutes to leave the premises, Silas said, his voice flat. Any personal items left behind will be incinerated. Your accounts have been frozen. The cars, the properties, the suits. They all belong to the group now. I looked at the wine stain on my shoes, the stain Julian had put there. It felt like a lifetime ago. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the gold watch Sarah had given me for our 5th anniversary, the only thing in the room that wasn't bought with Silas Vane's money. Strapped it to my wrist. I don't need your suits, Silas, I said, my voice steadying. And I don't need your company. You have nothing else, Julian mocked, stepping forward to try and shove me. I caught his wrist mid-air. The crack of his bone was audible in the silent penthouse. He screamed, dropping to his knees for the 2nd time that night. I leaned down, whispering into his ear so only he could hear. I spent 10 years learning how to build an empire from nothing. You spent 10 years learning how to lose one. I can do it again, but you'll always be the man who needed his dead father to save him from a nobody. I let go of his arm and walked toward the elevator. The crowd parted, but this time there was no murmuring, only a heavy, expectant silence. As the elevator doors began to close, I saw Elena leaning over to Silas, whispering something that made the old man's eyes narrow. I caught the final words before the doors sealed shut. We found the other ledger, sir. The one Leo was hiding. It's not just the company he was buying. It's the location of the vault in Switzerland. I hit the button for the lobby, my mind racing. They thought they had taken everything. They thought they had stripped me bare, but they didn't realize that the Omega Group wasn't the only one with a hidden agenda. I hadn't just been buying Julian's debt. I had been mapping the Vane family's offshore black sites for a decade. The elevator hit the lobby. I stepped out into the human night air. A man with no money, no home, and a wife who hated him. But as I reached the sidewalk, a nondescript grey sedan pulled up. The window rolled down to reveal a man I had recruited years ago, a man Julian had fired for a simple mistake. Is it done? He asked. They took the bait, I said, stepping into the car. Now let's show them what happens when you try to reclaim a debt from a man who has nothing left to lose. The grey sedan merged into the midnight traffic, its engine a low, predatory hum. I looked back at the penthouse, a glittering glass tower that felt like a tomb. For years I had stared at that skyline and seen a kingdom. Now I saw a target. They think they won, don't they? The driver asked, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. His name was Elias, a former data analyst for the Vanes, who had been discarded like trash for finding a discrepancy in the books. Silas Vane is a man of ego, I replied, leaning my head back against the cold leather. He thinks because he owns the bank, he owns the players. He has no idea the game moved to a different board months ago. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of plastic, a burner SIM card. I'd swapped out before security could seize my primary phone. I snapped it into a fresh device. My hands were steady, but my mind was a storm. Sarah's face, frozen in that moment of betrayal, burned behind my eyelids. I had saved her career, but I had lost her soul. "Where to?" Elias asked, taking a sharp turn into a dimly lit industrial district. "The secondary site. If Silas is as thorough as I remember, his teams are already at our primary safe house. They'll be looking for the Swiss ledger." "Do they know about the vault?" "They know it exists," I said, a dark smile touching my lips. "But Silas thinks the vault contains money. He thinks it's his stolen billions. He doesn't realize the vault contains something far more dangerous than gold. It contains the truth about how his dead wife actually died." Elias whistled low. "You're playing for blood now. He started the war the moment he involved Sarah," I whispered. "I was willing to take his company. Now I'm taking his legacy." We pulled into a derelict warehouse on the edge of the docks. The air smelled of salt and rust. Inside, the lights flickered, illuminating. A makeshift command center, bank after bank of servers hummed in the shadows. This was the other ledger Elena had mentioned. But something was wrong. The cooling fans were screaming at maximum speed. On the main monitor, a red progress bar was crawling toward 100%. They tracked the IP. Elias shouted, scrambling for the keyboard. "Leo, they're inside the server. They're wiping the Swiss coordinates." I lunged for the terminal, my fingers flying across the keys. Silas wasn't just taking the company. He was erasing every footprint I had ever made. He wanted me to be a ghost with no history and no evidence. "Block the port," I commanded. "If they get the encryption key, the vault in Switzerland will self-destruct. Everything we worked for, every piece of leverage will be gone." "I can't stop it." Elias's voice was panicked. "It's Elena. She's using a military-grade bypass. She's already at 90%. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a heavy metal fire extinguisher from the wall and slammed it into the main server rack. Sparks showered the room. The monitors went black. The screaming fans died into a terrifying silence. "You killed the server," Elias whispered, staring at the wreckage. "I didn't kill it," I said, breathing hard. "I locked it. Now the only way to get that data is with the physical hard drive. And there's only one person who knows where the physical backup is hidden." My phone buzzed in my hand. No caller ID. I knew the voice before I even answered. "You always were a violent child." "Leo." Silas's voice was smooth, amplified by the silence of the warehouse. "Destroying your own toys just so no one else can play with them. It's a pity. I really wanted to avoid the unpleasantness." "The unpleasantness is just beginning, Silas," I replied. "I'm not the scared kid you bought 10 years ago. I'm the man who knows your darkest secret." "Do you?" Silas laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Then perhaps you should ask yourself why your wife isn't answering her phone." My heart stopped. "If you touch her." "I haven't touched her yet," Silas purred. "But she's currently at the precinct, trying to report a theft of her husband's identity. The police are very interested in her story, especially since we've just filed a report claiming you embezzled $50 million from the Omega Group before the merger." I looked at the smashed server. I had the leverage, but Silas had the bait. He was framing me for the very crimes he had committed, and he was using Sarah as the witness. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice flat. "The backup drive. Hand it over at the docks, Pier 42, in 1 hour. Do that, and I'll make sure that evidence against you disappears. Sarah can keep her VP title. You can disappear to some island and live out your days in obscurity. And if I don't, then Sarah goes to prison as your accomplice. I've already planted the offshore signatures in her name." "Leo, she thinks you are protecting her. The police will think she was the mastermind." He hung up. I looked at Elias. He saw the look in my eyes, the look of a man who had just realized he was being forced to choose between his revenge and the woman he loved. "We can't give him the drive," Elias said. "It's our only shield." "I know," I said, reaching into the hollowed-out base of the server rack and pulling out a small silver drive. "But I'm not going to Pier 42 to give him the drive. I'm going there to finish this." 1 hour later, Pier 42. The fog was so thick I could barely see my own hands. The sound of the water lapping against the pilings was the only noise in the void. 2 sets of headlights cut through the gloom. A black sedan pulled up. The door opened and Julian stepped out. He was wearing a fresh suit, his broken arm in a sleek, expensive sling. He looked at me with a grin that made my skin crawl. "You look tired, Leo," Julian mocked. "Where's that chairman energy now? Hand over the drive. And maybe I'll let you watch from the bushes while I take Sarah out for a celebratory dinner." I held up the drive. "Where's Silas?" "He doesn't waste his time on insects," Julian said, reaching for the drive. "I'm the one you deal with now." I pulled the drive back. "There's one thing you forgot, Julian. I told you I mapped all the vein sites. I didn't just map the banks. I mapped the security protocols." Suddenly, the red and blue lights of a dozen police cruisers exploded out of the fog, surrounding the pier. Julian's face went pale. "What? What is this? You called the cops?" "You'll go down too." "I didn't call the cops for the embezzlement." "Julian," I said, stepping back into the shadows, "I called them for the body in the trunk of your car." Julian froze. He looked back at his own vehicle, his eyes wide with terror. The sirens were a deafening chorus, their lights reflecting off the oily surface of the river. Julian stood frozen, his hand still reaching for a drive that was no longer within his grasp. He looked at the police line, then at his own car, then back at me. The smug, predatory CEO had vanished, replaced by a terrified boy who finally realized he was a pawn in a game much deadlier than corporate takeovers. "There's no body in my car," Julian hissed, his voice cracking. "You're bluffing. You're desperate." "Am I?" I stepped closer, the salt spray of the harbor stinging my eyes. "Check your trunk, Julian. Or rather, remember the package. Silas asked you to transport. From the penthouse, basement 10 minutes before you left. He told you it was sensitive files. He told you it was the only way to save the family name." Julian's eyes darted to the black sedan. He remembered. The heavy lifting, the silent driver. The way Silas wouldn't look him in the eye. "He wouldn't," Julian whispered. "I'm his son." To Silas, "You aren't a son. You're a liability," I said, my voice barely audible over the shouting of the police officers as they moved in. He knew I wouldn't give the drive to a subordinate. He knew I'd come for him. "So he sent you with a gift that would ensure I never spoke again, and that you would be the one holding the smoking gun." The lead officer, a man with a face like granite, stepped forward with his weapon drawn, hands in the air. "Step away from the vehicle." Julian didn't move. He was staring at the trunk of his car as if he could see through the metal. I watched the realization sink in. Silas hadn't sent him to negotiate. He had sent him to be the fall guy. If Julian was arrested for a grisly crime, the Omega Group would be seen as a victim of a rogue executive's madness. The trail to the Swiss vault and Silas's true identity would be buried under a sensational murder trial. "Open it," I commanded, looking at Julian. "Show them what your father thinks of you." With trembling hands, Julian reached for the trunk release. The lid hissed open. The crowd of officers gasped. I felt a cold stone settle in my stomach. It wasn't what I expected. There was no body. Instead, the trunk was filled with millions of dollars in untraceable, sequential cash and Sarah's passport, drenched in red ink. "It's not a body, Julian," I realized, the horror dawning on me. "It's a frame. He's making it look like you and Sarah were fleeing the country with the embezzled funds." Julian let out a hysterical laugh. "See, no body? You're the one who's dead, Leo. You called the cops to a crime scene where my wife is the prime suspect." But the granite-faced officer didn't look at the money. He looked at me. Then he did something that made Julian's laughter die in his throat. He holstered his weapon and handed me a radio. "The perimeter is secure, Mr. Vance," the officer said. "We've intercepted the transport. Silas Vane is in custody." Julian's jaw dropped. "What? Who is this?" "Who are you people?" "These aren't city cops, Julian," I said, taking the radio. "They're a private security task force specializing in international financial crimes. I didn't call the police. I called the people Silas has been stealing from for 30 years. I looked at the silver drive in my hand. The drive isn't just leverage. It's a tracker. The moment Elias failed to stop the breach in the warehouse, the Omega Group servers didn't just take my data, they took a Trojan horse. It mapped Silas's entire hidden network in real time. We didn't need the vault in Switzerland. We needed him to try and protect it. Just as the officers began to cuff Julian, a phone rang. Not mine, not Julian's. It was coming from inside the trunk, buried beneath the stacks of cash. I reached in and pulled out a burner phone. The screen read, Elena. Leo, her silk-smooth voice answered. You're smarter than Silas gave you credit for. The Trojan horse was a nice touch, but you've always been too focused on the veins. I have Silas, Elena. It's over. Do you? She laughed, and this time there was a chilling edge to it. Look at the man in the granite face. Ask him who signed his paycheck this morning. I looked at the lead officer. He wasn't moving. He wasn't processing Julian. He was looking at the black sedan, waiting. Silas isn't in custody, Leo, Elena continued. He's on a private jet, halfway to the Alps. The men you're standing with. They aren't a task force. They're a cleanup crew. And their job isn't to arrest Julian. It's to make sure neither of you leaves that pier. The lead officer turned to me, his expression turning from professional to lethal. He didn't say a word. He just reached for a silencer in his tactical vest. Ilios. Now. I screamed into my own collar mic. A deafening explosion rocked the far end of the pier. A shipping container, rigged with thermite, turned into a sun-bright fireball, blinding the officers and creating a wall of smoke. I grabbed Julian by his good arm, the man I hated, the man who had humiliated me, and shoved him toward the edge of the dock. Jump! I yelled. What? I can't swim with a broken arm. Jump or die, Julian. Choose. We hit the freezing water just as a hail of suppressed gunfire shredded the air where we had been standing. The darkness of the harbor swallowed us. I struggled to keep Julian afloat, the weight of the silver drive in my pocket pulling me down like an anchor. We washed up a mile downshore, shivering and gasping for air in the shadows of an old shipyard. Julian was sobbing, the reality of his father's betrayal finally breaking him. I pulled the silver drive from my pocket. It was cracked. The casing was bent. The data, only thing that could clear Sarah's name and stop Silas, was potentially corrupted. I lost it, I whispered, staring at the broken tech. I lost everything to save you. No, Julian choked out, reaching into his soaked blazer. He pulled out a crumpled, wet piece of paper. He made me sign it before I left. He thought it was a confession. But look at the witness signature. I wiped the water from my eyes and looked at the paper. It wasn't a confession. It was a power of attorney. And the witness wasn't Elena. It was Sarah. The freezing wind whipped across the shipyard, but the cold I felt was nothing compared to the realization in my hands. Sarah's signature. She hadn't just seen my lies. She had been pulled into the very center of the Vane family's web. Silas hadn't just framed her, he had recruited her. Or at least he had made her think. She was the only one who could fix the chaos I had caused. She thinks she's saving the employees, Julian chattered, his teeth knocking together as he clutched his broken arm. My father. He told her you were a corporate raider who was going to liquidate the pension funds. He told her if she signed as the power of attorney, she could block the sale. He used her heart to lock the vault. I stood up, the broken silver drive heavy in my palm. The betrayal was complete. Silas didn't just want the money. He wanted to prove that even my love was a liability. He wanted me to watch as the woman I worshipped became the face of his crimes. We didn't go back to the warehouse. We went to the one place Silas would never look, the small, two-bedroom apartment where Sarah and I had lived before the promotion. That locks were still the same. The air smelled of her, perfume and the stale coffee. We'd shared the morning of the party. Why are we here? Julian asked, slumped against the kitchen counter. Because Silas is looking for a billionaire, I said, pulling a hidden floorboard up from beneath the dining table. He's forgotten what a man with nothing looks like. I pulled out an old, dusty laptop, the one I'd used to write my first lines of code 10 years ago. It wasn't connected to the Omega servers. It wasn't on the grid. It was the black box. The silver drive is broken, I muttered, plugging it in. The screen flickered, struggling to read the corrupted data. But I didn't just put the Swiss coordinates on that drive. I put the kill switch. What kill switch? The one that triggers if my heartbeat or my login isn't detected for 6 hours. Silas thinks he's flying to the Alps to open a vault. He's actually flying into a trap that will broadcast every transaction he's ever made to the Global Tax Authority the second he touches the biometric scanner. I left Julian in the apartment and headed for the Vane Dynamics headquarters one last time. I didn't use the elevator. I used the service stairs, the ones Julian had told me I belonged in. I reached the top floor. The lights were dim. I heard voices coming from the executive suite. Silas's voice. And Sarah's. "You're doing the right thing." "Sarah," Silas was saying, his voice a fatherly purr. "Leo was a tragedy. A man consumed by greed. But with your signature on these final filings, we can restore order. We can protect the families of this company." "I just can't believe it was all a lie," Sarah whispered. I could hear the tears in her voice. The house. The life. It was all just a game to him. I stepped into the room. "It wasn't a game, Sarah." They both spun around. Silas's eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively reaching for the silent alarm on his desk. Sarah's face was a map of agony. "Leo? How are you?" "The police. The police were his, Sarah," I said, walking toward the desk. "Julian is alive. He's safe. And he told me everything. Silas didn't bring you here to save the company. He brought you here to be the last hand on the document so that when the tax fraud is revealed, the trail ends at your desk, not his." "Don't listen to him," Silas hissed. "He's a cornered animal. He'll say anything to take me down with him." "I don't have to say anything, Silas," I said, leaning over the desk, "because 10 minutes ago, your jet landed in Zurich, and your private security just informed you that the vault is ready for your thumbprint." Silas froze. A small device in his pocket buzzed. He pulled it out, his face turning the color of bone as he read the alert. "What did you do?" "The vault doesn't contain the ledger of your wife's death." "Silas, I already sent that to the authorities yesterday. The vault is empty. But the moment you tried to access it, you authorized a full forensic audit of every shell company Sarah just signed for. You didn't protect the company. Sarah, you just gave the government the keys to his prison cell." Silas lunged for me, his composure finally shattering. He looked like the monster he was: old, desperate, and cruel. But before he could reach me, the doors burst open. This time it wasn't my private security. It wasn't Silas's cleanup crew. It was the actual federal authorities. The handcuffs clicked around Silas Vane's wrists. He didn't go out with a bang. He went out in silence, looking like a frail old man who had finally run out of secrets. Elena was led out behind him, her sharp red suit finally losing its luster. Julian walked in 10 minutes later, leaning on a federal agent. He looked at his father, then at me. For the first time in our lives, there was no mockery in his eyes, only a strange, hollow respect. Sarah stood by the window, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. I walked over to her, but I didn't touch her. I didn't deserve to. "I kept the secret because I thought I was protecting you," I said. But I realize now that I was just protecting my own pride. I wanted to be the hero who saved you, but I became the villain who tricked you. Sarah looked at me, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "You bought the company for me, Leo, but you lost the man I married in the process. I'm going to turn it all over to a blind trust," I told her. "The money, the shares, the asset, it's going to the employees' pension fund, the one Silas robbed. I'm walking away with exactly what I had the day we met. Nothing." 3 months later, I was sitting on a bench in a small park, far from the glass towers and the rooftop galas. I was wearing a simple, off-the-rack suit. My shoes were clean, but they weren't Italian leather. A shadow fell over me. I looked up. It was Sarah. She wasn't wearing Cartier. She wasn't the VP of a billion-dollar firm. She was just Sarah. "I heard the fund is fully restored," she said, sitting down beside me. "The employees are calling it the anonymous miracle." "It wasn't a miracle," I said. "It was just a long overdue payment." We sat in silence for a long time, watching the world go by. The undercover boss was gone. The chairman was a myth. "Julian sent me a letter," she said.